Well, let's take nationalism first. I mean, looking at this pile here, 75% at least.
Yeah, yeah,
Important.
absolutely. Yeah.
I'm slightly puzzled. I don't think this is his most important work. I had the privilege and pleasure of actually being sitting beside him when he was writing his nationalism book. So he wrote it in 1983
Mm.
in Fontanile in the Italian Alps when Sarah and I were on holiday. I mean, he wrote it before and after, but he was writing it. So we would sort of go in and he was very hospitable and we'd drink red wine and we might have talked about it a bit. But I suspect it's like many people who are beside someone who's writing an important book, they don't talk about it much. And so I wasn't aware that the book for which he would be mostly remembered.
Mm.
I think trying to, I mean, you may have your theories as to why so many so many of them have focused on that. And I think one of the things is it's much the simplest book. It's a short book and its argument is very simple. It's a simple book about a very important subject, which is nationalism. And at the time, it fitted into a larger debate that was going on with Hobsbawm and Benedict Anderson and Kaduri and all these sort of people. So it made a big impression. It was perhaps the best known of his books.
It was probably linked also to policy as well. I know a lot of politicians were interested in nationalism and what it meant, and I mean, there was a lot of discussion about that as well, wasn't there? I mean, this is what David Gellner talks about, that nationalism is the book that everyone reads.
Yes.
What David Gellner's papers about, which you'll read later, is about legitimation of belief and that stuff, which is, I think, a much more interesting book. But anyway.
So do I. I mean, I think the stuff about the philosophical
Yeah.
epistemology and so on,
Right.
and his attempt to answer the Weberian questions of the meaning, how we can preserve
Absolutely.
meaning in a modern rational world. That is what he was really interested in. Nationalism was a side product. And so I'm puzzled. And it means that in some ways, the papers are not entirely satisfying because they're going on round and round and round and round. And most of them say this, the obvious thing is that his view is fairly limited. The one I'm commenting on, which is nationalism in Taiwan and China, basically says it doesn't apply in China at all, and it only sort of applies a bit in Taiwan because it's an island and the Japanese encouraged it and so on. But basically, it's no use in East Asia. A number of them sort of point out that it's the weaknesses, and those were my feelings about it. The obvious one as a historian is his I think he's not as simple as to say that industrialization and mass education will automatically cause nationalism, but he sees an elective affinity anyway, and probably a causal link between them.
Mm.
And he seems to take for granted, as many European thinkers, and it's interesting that many of them are, like Hobsbawm and Gellner, of a European background. They tend to take the model of what nationalism is and when it happened from Europe.
Yeah.
So it's perfectly true that nationalism is in terms of a European thinker, it's a 19th century phenomenon. In France and Germany, Italy, they all become nations in mid to late 19th century, and East Europe a little later. And that's the time of industrialization and mass education. So it fits fairly well for Middle Europe and Europe. But once you get outside there, and this point is made about Benedict Anderson, he was, I think, possibly born in China, but he was certainly brought up and spent a lot of his time in East Asia. So his idea, which is wider, which is that it's an imagined community caused by print, and capitalism fits better, expands it to bits of South Asia and bits of South America and so on a bit better. One thing is it's just a small point, but basically his idea was not new. The idea that what you do with making a nation is to imagine that you are linked to people who you don't know personally because it's too large, is probably very old. I suspect you'd find it in classical philosophy, but you certainly find it in Tocqueville. Tocqueville used the word ideal community, and he says that, you know, when you go around America, you find that they all think they are Americans. We don't do that in France, but in America, they're united. And it fits a bit with Anderson because he says newspapers and printing, which distributes an Americanness across even in the remotest parts of America, where he notices they're reading newspapers, gives them a sense of unity and an ideal community. But my view is that it's much deeper than that. I mean, if you define, I mean, the simple test, the Gellnerian test on nationalism is if you go up to someone in a part of a country and you say, who are you? And they say, we are English. Or perhaps they wouldn't do it in that simple way. But if you said, the French are coming, are you going to fight against them? And they would say, yes, we are English. I mean, even, I think it was, may have been St. Augustine or someone earlier, said that when they met English people in the 8th or 9th century in Italy, and they asked them who they were, and they said, we are English. Now, I was brought up in the school of James Campbell, the medievalist and Anglo-Saxonist, who said that from at least the time of Alfred, you had the infrastructure for nationalism. That is, you had a unified language, unified law, unified tax system, unified economy, and a unified political system. And you had abounded, the seas were there, you had the Scots over there, and you had us, who were the English. The Welsh were there, the Scots were there, and we are the English. And if you had gone, certainly in Chaucer's time and earlier, and ask someone, why are we fighting the French? And you'd see, it's all in Shakespeare and, you know, Agincourt and all that stuff. So it's, I think that it's a very, very old feature of islands. And I think the same, you'd find the same in Japan, another island, because when, for example, Kublai Khan invaded Japan in the end of the 13th century, the Japanese fought them off. And when people travel around Japan, Japan was unified in all the ways I mentioned, politically, economically, socially, and so on. So although you have great regional variations and you have regional dialects and so on and so on, I think the Japanese and the English from at least 1,000 years ago felt of themselves as part of an imagined larger unit. And certainly the Dutch did as soon as Holland emerged. I think the Portuguese did. I think the Swedes did under Gustavus Adolphus. In other words, if you have small entities, usually bounded by the sea or the edge of a sea, confronting something else, and with a unified set of things that I've mentioned, you tend to get. So nationalism is very old, and therefore you can't tie it to industrialization. You can't tie it to mass education. You can, to a certain extent, tie it to a uniform, quite sophisticated culture. It doesn't have to be highly literate, but I think, you know, when you traveled around England or Japan, you would find that people, they weren't peasants in the traditional sense as they were in France or Germany. And so they would know about the wider world. I mean, we were very struck, Sarah and I, when we edited Ralph Josselin's diary in the middle of the 17th century, how much he was interested in and knew about what was going on in Turkey or Russia or across Europe, or, you know, he was as sophisticated. The news was coming in, and you lived in a much wider world. And I suspect if you looked at medieval literature, if you look at Chaucer, or you look at other books or letters of that time, they weren't living sort of rural peasant lives in these villages. They were part of something much bigger. So my view is that he took a limited model, which